This is episode 314 of Rogue State of Mind, formerly known as MitoLife Radio. I'm your host, Matt Blackburn. Today, I'm excited to have back on the show Dr. Scott Sherr. I've had him on several times the past 5 years. I'm pretty sure I've mispronounced his last name every time, but I think I got it this time. He is the COO of Troscriptions. They pioneered the Methylene Blue supplement that's now very popular, especially lately with a lot of fear articles about it. And when I saw it, I immediately shared my thoughts of how ridiculous it was on social media and decided to do a show with Scott to debunk a lot of these myths around the dangers of supplementing this really safe supplement. So in this show, Scott addresses the blue brain idea that methylene blue will permanently turn your brain blue. We talk about serotonin syndrome. He breaks down what that is, how it's extremely rare, and how he's actually using methylene blue with his patients to actually wean off of SSRIs. He addresses the synthetically sourced argument that not everything synthetic is bad for us, is his response to that. And we go back and forth a little bit, and I share my thoughts there. He talks about the mitochondrial effects. One of the arguments is that in healthy people with healthy mitochondria, methylene blue will actually downregulate ATP production and is not good to take. I ask him about genetic mutations and that relationship with methylene blue. We talk a little bit about smoking. I like cigars. I ask him if methylene blue can help me with that. He talks about the worry that methylene blue will inhibit nitric oxide, and he goes on a pretty good rant about that, differentiating between INOS and ENOS. I've been taking this supplement for 5 years, Troscriptions, haven't experienced any downside, short-term or long-term. I think the fear is unfounded, and as Scott says in the show, these people do not work with patients. They are not practicing doctors. They are essentially blog article authors or YouTube video creators. And that's a lot different from working with patients one-on-one like Dr. Scott does for a living. So enjoy the show. Here is Dr. Scott Sherr. All right, Dr. Scott Sherr, welcome back to the show.
Now it's the Rogue State of Mind with Matt Blackburn. I'm excited to be here, man. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. I always love chatting with you. I lost count how many chats we've had. Maybe this is like the 5th or something like that.
This is definitely the record as far as the number of guest appearances that I've had on a podcast, and I appreciate it. Like you're a curious guy. You're one that's not afraid to change their mind and tell everybody about it. But throughout the whole, I think the first podcast we did was probably like 2020. I want to say.
So,
and that kind of brings it all back home, right? Because we started talking about methylene blue very early in that process, and you were one of the first people to be like, "This is something that's legit." Through that whole COVID era, it was an upheaval of many sorts, and now you're on your 3rd or 4th home with a bunker. So lots have happened to you. Like I said, lots have happened in the world. Lots have happened, obviously in my life and the world of methylene blue that has gotten very popular all of a sudden in the last several months, as you know.
Yeah. And I like your grounded approach with it because I'm Mr. Megadose with certain things, but it's kind of like consistent dosing, like more so with vitamin C. And I have kind of a different philosophy with different supplements. I'm more about consistency now, more than anything. But I know there's some practitioners out there recommending like only high doses of methylene blue work. And I love how your education focused on, use this dose for this and this frequency. And I think I heard you in a show recently, you were saying like 2 to 3 times a week is generally a good schedule. Is that kind of right? Or?
Yeah. I think for people that are relatively well optimized, that are looking to use it as a enhancement, whether it would be in performance both physical or mental performance, or from a perspective of recovery and that aspect, I think 2-3 times a week for an average human is probably a good idea. But no, let's kind of back up there. What does average human mean, right? And so the other thing is, if you're relatively, what I really mean there is that if you're relatively well optimized, because as you know, and I think we've spoken about, like 94% of US adults have metabolic dysfunction, which means that they can't make energy effectively, or they can't detox appropriately from the energy that they make. And so the whole system gets mucked up in the process. And so if you're one of those 94%, which is probably true, you likely can benefit from methylene blue at least 2-3 times a week, if not more, initially, as you're working on optimizing your mitochondria, your diet, your lifestyle, your behavior, all the other things that go along with that. And so I have some people that I work with that take methylene blue on the regular. Like, they take it on a daily basis, maybe 7 days a week for 3, 6, 12 months, depending on the person. Oftentimes that's low dose. And I have others that are like endurance athletes that use it for this 2-3 times a week to help with endurance or help with recovery, if they're going on an airplane, because we know everything that happens on an airplane. So I'm of the vein that most people can benefit from methylene blue some of the time, that some of the people can benefit from methylene blue all the time. And there's a few people out there that probably don't need it very much at all, right? But in general, it's such a supportive compound. I think there's lots of applications no matter where you are on the health spectrum.
Yeah. The long COVID thing is the most fascinating to me, because I had it, I don't know, 5 times. And there's people that don't believe viruses exist. I'm not one of those. But up here in the boonies in North Idaho, I interact with a lot of people building out acreage and working with plumbers and electricians and contractors. And there's just a lot of face to face. And if I start to feel a cough coming on or a scratchy throat, it always amazes me when I take Just Blue, which is my favorite product from your company. I'll take Just Blue, just a whole troche. I just swallow the whole thing.
Yep.
And like really within hours, sometimes the cough, the scratchiness goes away and I'll start coughing less. Like that happened this morning. So I took one.
Nice.
And that's,
nice.
I'm just always surprised how quickly it works. And then you have that feedback of like the leukomethylene blue. If you're peeing clear, I could tell I was fighting something. And then if I didn't need it, it's that dark blue urine, which I don't know. Am I on point with that thought?
Yeah, it's so when we first started the company and we were getting the feedback like from you and others, that there seemed to be a shift in how much methylene blue you needed, and that could potentially be correlated with the type of urine that you were urinating, or micturating is the technical term for urinating, by the way. You're always urinating, and then micturating is when you actually let the urine. The more you know, right? But anyway, so we thought that when you're under more oxidative load, more stress, there was more inflammation in the system, that in those cases, it would take a higher dose of methylene blue for you to urinate blue, meaning that you didn't need anymore, as you just described. But we found over the years, Matt, is that it's much more variable than that. Some people will have that experience, but some people won't overall. What I always say, though, is that if you're taking methylene blue and your urine hasn't turned blue yet, and you don't feel anything, in quotes, then keep going up on the dose at least until you start having blue urine. And you mentioned something about viral infections earlier, or just a minute ago, about your experience. It's funny, actually, in developing countries, until like the 1960s or 70s, they would give kids methylene blue lollipops, and they would actually suck on the lollipop for viral infections, for sore throats, just like you described it. And of course, it would paint their whole mouth inside blue, but it was a great way to deal with viral infections. And it still is now. And we know that the cool thing about methylene blue from an anti-infective perspective, this is typically higher doses. Like 16 is kind of on the lower end, but for like a low grade viral thing, it actually can be very, very helpful overall. But what methylene blue does, especially at higher doses, is that it increases the amount of hydrogen peroxide that's being made in the system. And people get scared about hydrogen peroxide because they see it as a cleaner, and you can buy it online and do weird things about it or with it in your ears and other orifices probably. But hydrogen peroxide is made by our cells to kill bugs, and it kills virus, bacteria, fungus. And so this is why methylene blue was used so ubiquitously back into the 1950s, excuse me, from about 1897 until the 1950s, because there were no other antimicrobials around. And then it worked really, really well except it made your urine blue. And at very high doses, like over 200 milligrams of a dose of methylene blue, other secretions would turn blue as well, like your tears and your poop, evidently. This has not happened to me. I don't have personal experience, so I don't know, but higher doses can do this. But in general, because it can make this hydrogen peroxide at these higher amounts of methylene blue. So typically this is around a milligram per kilogram or a little bit less than that. So an average US adult, talking about 70 milligrams of methylene. Because it makes hydrogen peroxide at those levels, you get the killing of those types of bugs. But at the same time, the way typically what happens is that you take an antibiotic, and over time, those antibiotics don't work against infections because the bugs become resistant to the antibiotic. But because it works on the hydrogen peroxide side of things, there is no resistance patterns. So you don't get resistance to methylene blue. So you can use it and reuse it if needed, and you don't get those resistance patterns, which is obviously fantastic. And so like the first indication for methylene blue in 1897 was malaria. And they used very high doses of methylene blue at the time. Now, obviously, many years later, they're not using methylene blue very much for malaria. But what's happening is a lot of the bugs are resistant to those antibiotics and antiparasitics and things like that we are typically using. And so methylene blue is coming back into favor because those drugs don't work anymore. So I love it as an anti-infective. I have it in my cabinet and feel like if I feel like something's coming on, I have it, all my patients have it in their cabinets, if in their medicine cabinets, as it were, if they feel like something's coming on, definitely would get the methylene blue on board early. And the earlier, the better, like these sort of abortive interventions, but it's fantastic for that.
Amazing. Yeah. Like you said, it's coming back into favor. And I think it was 2 or 3 weeks ago, I started to see these articles coming out. I think I saw it on Facebook first. It was the blue brain. It's going to stain your brain permanently. Blue. And you made great rebuttals to a lot of these things. And there was Saladino, there was Chris Masterjohn. We can get into their specific arguments. But your initial response, from what I remember, it was that it was a huge, massive dose, and it was like immediate. The picture was immediately taken after the person died, and It was IV form. And the methylene blue switches back and forth. You've talked about, right? Where it could be, I think that's like similar to vitamin C, right? Where it could be an oxidant or an antioxidant.
Yeah. So with methylene blue, it's a redox cycler. So it can help, it can donate electrons or pick them up. And a lot of antioxidants, what they mainly do is pick up free electrons, right? That's what most of them do overall. That's what makes it an antioxidant. It can actually pick up free radicals and neutralize them. That's what vitamin C typically does. And most of our other antioxidants as well. What's different about methylene blue is that it also can donate electrons. And so it can take those electrons that it picks up. So methylene blue is blue when it's in its oxidized form, which means that it is able to actually pick up free electrons. When it picks up those electrons, it then becomes reduced. And when it's in its reduced form, it's called leucomethylene blue. And that's when it loses its blue color and it becomes colorless overall. So that's the two states that methylene blue lives in. It goes back and forth between the two all the time. And the article that you're referring to on blue brains it was great in so many social media ways, right? It was shocking. It was these autopsy brains that were blue. And so the dude that wrote the article did a great job at sort of doing the clickbait kind of thing, right? And as you know, Matt, like when something gets more popular, there's always going to be people that are trying to capitalize on that popularity. And the best way to do that on social media, as you very well know, is to take shit on it, take a huge shit on it. and that's what they did, right? And that's what this guy was trying to do. But as you just mentioned, the study itself was a autopsy report of blue brains, right? Some of these people did get methylene blue, that is true, but they got really high doses of it in the IV. So the average dose was 3 milligrams per kilogram IV. They get like 1 milligram per kilogram, then get another. Wow. And then, so 3 milligrams per kilogram on average, just to give people real numbers, was about 200 to 250 milligrams of methylene blue. Wow. A huge amount. And this is in the IV. So IV's going to get into the body the fastest for sure. And it's going to go to the brain the fastest. So it is not at all surprising that these autopsies showed blue brains as a result of that. But you have to realize why they were using these high doses. These were last ditch efforts to save people's lives that were dying. They had people with cardiopulmonary arrest. They had PEA arrest as well. Like they had pulseless electromagnetic activity. So basically, their heart was firing, but nothing was happening, kind of thing. And then people with severe septic shock and infections. And so it was all these people that had like massive mortality rates, like 95%. And then they were trying as a last ditch to just pound them with these huge doses of IV methylene blue. So again, I hope none of us have to get into a situation that requires it, but give me a blue brain and try to save my life, please, if it's that point, right? Like, and that's what I would tell people. So in essence, very, very low doses of methylene blue. We're talking about 4 milligrams, 8, 16, less than a milligram per kilogram for sure. And especially orally, oral methylene blue for a period of time is going to have you're going to have a blue pigment in your mitochondria. Your brain's not going to be blue, but there's going to be a blue pigment. That's what methylene blue does. It concentrates in the mitochondria itself. And so you want that, right? And so that's what got everybody so excited about methylene blue back into the 50s and 60s when they realized it was concentrating in this beautiful energy producing organelle called the mitochondria. So fantastically done in the social media world to discuss or to bring up the possibility of a blue brain. But in the end, none of us have to worry about it with regular dosing of methylene blue for mitochondrial optimization or even for infection. It's really not going to happen overall. But I appreciate that it brought up some interesting points here to discuss as far as dosing and route of administration. Certainly, as I mentioned, IV is going to go to the brain the fastest. And then you have oral, it's going to be, the buccal troche is going to be the second fastest. And then, swallowing it's going to be the third fastest. I guess you can inhale methylene blue now too. I've seen people doing that. That's probably going to be.
I've tried it. Yeah.
Oh, you have. How'd that
go? I just used I forget the brand of the nebulizer, but it was one of the better nebulizers. But those things are prone to breaking. At least the one I had. And I would just put the liquid form into some base of water, a few drops, and yeah, I think it turned my right under my nose blue. So that was annoying.
Yeah, I'm sure
because it's hard to snort it straight. So
yeah,
I only tried it a few times. I'm like, I'm just gonna take it orally.
Yeah, it sounds like a better idea. But there's also eye drops I've seen now.
Yep.
There's inhaled, and there's lots of different ways. But the interesting thing about methylene blue, regardless of the delivery method, is that almost 100% of it's going to get into the body in an active form. Most supplements that we take, or most drugs even, get at least partially inactivated by the liver itself. The thing about methylene blue is that it doesn't happen. So even if you swallow it, most of that's going to get into the system. It's just a matter of what that peak level is going to be over what period of time, right? So obviously IV is going to be happening very, very fast. And the other methods will be slower in various ways. And I think that's the other big part that's important for people to realize is that like a lot of the studies out there that showed detrimental effects of methylene blue, usually we're giving it IV. And then they also were giving much higher doses overall. So it's a very different animal than taking like a low dose oral or a troche over a period of time.
Makes sense. Yeah. Are you a fan of the IVs plus red light where they're, dosing you with methylene blue, blood irradiation with red light? Or do you think you get the same effect just taking it orally and going in front of a red light panel? You don't have to go that invasive route of directly doing it to your blood.
Yeah. I mean, I think it depends on the situation overall. I think for the most part, the IV and the UV radiation or the near-infrared infrared can be very, very powerful for people with infection. I've seen some really great results using that. But overall, like a mitochondrial optimization perspective, regeneration, I don't think it's necessary to do that. But if there's an acute presentation, like for example, and like there's no studies on this in humans, but there's acute stroke studies, there's acute traumatic brain injury studies, where there's a hypoxic, like low oxygen environment, I would not be averse to using IV and near infrared to try to do our best to like get more blood flow and more oxygen capacity, really more aerobic capacity to the tissue at a faster clip overall. But so that's another reason why I have all my patients keep their higher dose methylene blue available if they have an acute infection like we were discussing, but also acute trauma, acute ischemic episode. Like it doesn't negate your need to like go to the freaking hospital if you need to go to the hospital, but taking a large dose of methylene blue, like maybe up to 2 milligrams per kilogram is something that I would I personally recommend my patients do. There's not data in humans, but I think that the safety profile is good enough that it's not going to harm anything. It only could potentially help.
And you combine it with HBOT, right?
Yeah. So typically when I'm combining it with hyperbaric therapy, it depends on the situation. Like oftentimes what I'm doing there is low doses before hyperbaric therapy to help support the mitochondria so that they have more capacity to help you make energy while you're in the chamber. And then there's other people like in the recovery performance space where I'll use methylene blue 2 to 3 hours after their hyperbaric chamber experience, because then it's in the recovery mode and it can help with sort of the cleanup and the detox and things like that. Because when you go in a hyperbaric chamber, as you know, Matt, like you're increasing the amount of oxygen in circulation dramatically, and all that oxygen is going to do one of two things. It's going to help try to make more energy, but if you can't do that very well, it's going to make a huge amount of oxidative stress, reactive oxygen species, and then the body has to deal with that, right? There's therapeutic benefit to having a massive oxidative load, like exercise, for example, in hyperbaric therapy, but you have to be able to neutralize that oxidative load with having antioxidant capacity, right? That being in the situation where you actually can make energy effectively in the first place. And so methylene blue can support both those processes. It can help you with the energy production side of things. And then it can also help with the detox side thing. So I've seen it really be great for like a number of different types of people, but especially brain related stuff. So I see a lot of people on the concussion side, for example, and I've seen a lot of benefit bringing in the methylene blue along with the hyperbaric treatment. But what's lovely about the methylene blue piece, as you know, is they don't have to go anywhere. They don't have to get into a chamber. I mean, I like them to, but at least I can get them started on something quickly that's going to help start the repair process, even if they can't get to a facility or don't have the money to do that, or whatever it may be overall.
Yeah. I moved my chamber from my last house, and one of the fittings, I think it rolled on the trailer or something, and it broke one of the compression fittings for one of the hoses. And so I'm talking to OxyHelp right now, and it's some European part. So hopefully I can get back in that thing now that I have the time to use it. And it's my favorite thing to nap inside is the 2-atmosphere hard chamber. It's like a super nap.
It is. Yeah, we call it the oxygen nap for sure. Yeah, I know when you're off the grid, you couldn't run it. It was just too much power drain.
Now I have unlimited power. Yeah.
Nice.
And I put up solar, so yeah, I'll be even better. But
nice.
Well, I want to get into some of the other. So we talked about the blue brain.
Yep.
Serotonin syndrome is another critique that I've heard lately, and I think Saladino and Master John. I mean, all the guys I think included that in their kind of anti-articles that you get too much serotonin. Yeah.
So Saladino did two things. So Paul Saladino mainly was saying that people feel better on methylene blue because of the serotonin.
Right.
So he's saying that nothing to do with mitochondrial function, that it was all related to serotonin. And Chris Masterjohn, PhD, the biochemist, was mentioning that there's a high risk of combining methylene blue with serotonergic drugs and serotonin syndrome.
Supplements.
And so, first of all, so to be clear about this, Dr. Paul Saladino is an MD, but he does not see patients. He never has, or at least hasn't in a long time. So whatever he's telling his listeners is his own opinion, and he has no clue what it means when you actually work with people and how you nuance this and how it's not as black and white as you may think. Chris Masterjohn, and by the way, with Paul, I like some of his content. I think that he lives what he says. He's in the jungle. He's a carnivore, and he's doing all the things, and he's got a great hang. He can overhead hang for 10 minutes. I was shocked at that. That's good stuff. But when it comes to medical advice, why am I listening to him if he doesn't see patients, as far as I'm concerned? So because he doesn't know the nuances of all this. The second, Chris Masterjohn, is that Chris is a fantastic biochemist and he's a great researcher. But again, he does not see patients. He does not understand how these things work clinically in real time and how things are not what they look like in a textbook. I can't emphasize this enough. People do not fall on pages of a textbook. They can have 10 different things going on 10 different pages. And then how do you do that, right? So now we have, LLMs and we have things like that are becoming almost as good as doctors in some ways, and they will continue to get better and better. But if you don't see patients, it's very difficult for me as a clinician to listen to you talk to me and everybody else about what you think should be happening for everybody else when you don't actually see people for a living, right? Is what it comes down to. So that being said, what I would say is this. Let's go to serotonin syndrome first, right? So if you ever go to a medical conference where there's a lot of MDs and DOs and like people that see patients, mostly MDs and DOs, because they would have trained in a hospital. And you ask those people that have been in practice a long time. Sorry about that. That was my daughter.
No worries.
Is if you ask people that have been in practice for a long time, has anybody ever seen serotonin syndrome before? Out of maybe 100 people, maybe 2 or 3 people will raise their hand. It's extremely rare. So serotonin syndrome, just to define it, is when the system has too much serotonin on board, and as a result can get what we call hemodynamic instability. Basically, you can get headaches, you can get tremors, you can get seizures, you can get high blood pressure. It's extremely rare overall. So the only study that has shown potential for serotonin syndrome using methylene blue was using IV methylene blue, along with somebody that had an SSRI on board. Okay. And so the risk of a serotonin syndrome with an oral methylene blue, especially very, very low doses, even when some of those other medications or supplements are on board that are increasing serotonin, that are increasing dopamine, increasing norepinephrine, because methylene blue doesn't only increase serotonin, it also increases norepinephrine and dopamine. The risk is extremely low if you keep your dose of methylene blue low. Now, that being said, if you are on these medications, it's extremely important that you work with a healthcare provider, because you may feel different as you're taking them, because you are going to have more of these neurotransmitters hanging around, right? So you'll have more serotonin, norepinephrine, and dopamine, but there's actually some decent clinical data on methylene blue for Parkinson's, for example. And part of that's probably because it increases dopamine, but another part of it is actually increasing mitochondrial optimization and mitochondrial function and rebooting mitochondrial function. So when we first started the company, I was like, if you're taking SSRIs, don't try methylene blue, right? Taking SNRIs, if you're taking dopaminergic drugs, if you're even taking these supplements like 5-HTP, don't even think about taking methylene blue. But now, after 5 years of clinical practice, using it, understanding it, the risks are extremely low overall. Now, my patients, my clinical practice, I am having patients that are on SSRIs, starting methylene blue, and that what we're doing is actually weaning them off the SSRIs over time, because there actually are studies that show that methylene blue has the capacity to work like an antidepressant. Like it can, there's a study in depression, there's been studies in bipolar overall. Part of that is definitely the neurotransmitter ecosystem that you're creating as a result of being on methylene blue. But the part that's not talked about as much, that I think is probably more important, is the aspects of mitochondrial optimization, rebooting mitochondrial function. So the risk of serotonin syndrome is almost zero at very low doses. If you're taking 4, 8, 16, 25 milligrams, if you're getting to above a milligram per kilogram, like 70 milligrams or so and above, and you're taking it regularly, that's when things I think get a little bit more dicey overall. And you want to be thinking about it and and then being very closely monitored overall. But in general, as long as you're not getting IV methylene blue, then the risk of serotonin syndrome is extremely, extremely low. And so, you get these people like Chris and Paul and others. I see it all over the place. Like, oh, don't do this. Like, don't take methylene blue because you're going to get serotonin syndrome if you take 5-HTP. It's not going to happen. Like, there's just not, if you were taking like maybe a gram of 5-HTP a day, which, usually the dose is like 50 or 100 milligrams, right? Yeah. So maybe you'd feel weird. And I don't recommend that, right? People always ask me about psychedelics too. You mentioned, we were talking a little bit about that before we started recording, like the psychedelics, like your psilocybin, your LSD, especially, they are serotonin agonists, right? So they're increasing the amount of serotonin that's going to be around. And so as a result of that, I always recommend like just abstaining from methylene blue for 24 to 48 hours before and after. If you're taking less, this is also an important one, if you're taking less than about 80 milligrams of methylene blue per day, it will be completely out of your system if you have normal kidneys within 24 hours. Okay. So the half-life of methylene blue orally is about between 4 and 6 hours overall. And so as a result of that, if you take less than 100 milligrams, about 80 milligrams a day, it'll be completely out of your system within 24 hours. If you are taking more than 100 milligrams of methylene blue per day, it is going to start building up in your system. And so you have to be aware of that. And that could be dangerous, right? Because then if you have more building up, it's not going to completely get out of the system. And then the methylene blue has this, what's called a hormetic dose response curve, meaning that, at some point at a higher level, like around that 2 milligram to 3 milligram per kilogram, so over 150 to 300 milligrams, you're going to have potentially more just stress in the system itself rather than it being something that could be supportive overall. And so you have to be careful. So if you're taking more, typically what I do, like the protocol that I give people overall, Matt, is like, if you're taking more than about 30 milligrams of methylene blue per day, you should probably have at least 1 day off per week. If you're taking more than 50 to 70 milligrams per day, probably should be taking at least 2 days off per week. And then if you're taking more than that, it just depends, right? But at least give people a feel of taking breaks if they're taking those higher doses, because it is potentially going to build up in the system over time, especially if you're taking higher doses. But short story to your question, serotonin syndrome, extremely rare, never seen in clinical practice, very unlikely to happen if it's not IV methylene blue. Low doses are very safe, but if you're on meds that increase those same neurotransmitters, then work with the doc and watch it closely.
With the dosage, quick question on that. Does that take a break recommendation go out the window if someone's dealing with like chronic infection, like long COVID, and they have a lot of symptoms, because their body will use it up quicker, right? Or it'll be utilized quicker?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I typically still will recommend, if you're taking over, especially between 50 and 70 milligrams, if you're a milligram per kilogram or so per day, I do think that taking at least 1 day off per week is likely a good idea, even for chronic infection overall.
Okay.
Now, in some patients, what we'll do is we won't do that initially. We'll keep them on like a regular amount and not take days off for 2 to 4 weeks or something like that. And then depending on the situation, we may end up starting to take days off per week after that. But I find that's a better practice is to think about taking days off, like 1 day off a week, if you're going to be taking high doses. But I mean, in the end, Matt, you and I know that most people don't need those high doses. Most people benefit from 4, 8, 16, 25 milligrams from a mitochondrial perspective. So it's a rare occasion, but it's real when people need these higher doses. I'll use these higher doses oftentimes for like an acute viral infection, a fungal bacterial. I'll use orally 2 milligrams per kilogram. So about 150 milligrams of methylene blue. And I'll do that for 3 to 5 days. And then I'll quickly titrate them down from those higher doses. And that's pretty common for me to use in clinical practice overall. Sometimes I'll do, for more like a chronic gut infection, for example, we can use like 50 to 100 milligrams a day for 5 to 10 days. And that can really go well, actually. They might get like a Herxheimer kind of reaction from that. Like they might get a little detox and not feel very good for a little bit. But typically that's, if you coach them through that, it's going to be okay. You know what those are all about, right? So,
I might have asked you this in previous conversations, and you might have like a practitioner's only option for this, but high dose, basically like high dose just blue troches, because you'd have to take several boxes, right?
Yeah, we have one called Tro Plus Blue, and Tro Plus Blue is the 50 milligrams. So we have Just Blue, which is 16 milligrams per troche. And then we have our Tro Plus Blue, which is 50 milligrams per troche. And those are for practitioners only. So you can't get that as a regular consumer right now, but we do have a growing list of practitioners that, on a map that we can send you to and help you get those if you need them as well. So, but in the end, because it's a higher dose, we really did feel like having a little bit more supervision would be better overall. And then for the lower doses, your 16 milligram troche of Just Blue, have at it, right? And so, and that's what's gotten so popular, as you know, over the last 3 or 4 months, because of all the media that's been around methylene blue, which has been great overall. But it comes with the haters going to hate too, right? So, and that's okay. That's what we're dispelling some of these myths today, which is good.
Yeah, I found firsthand that haters boost sales, so it's actually a great thing overall to get more attention.
I'm not crying about it. It's all good. And that gives me an opportunity to fine tune the conversation about various points. So I'm all for it, right? It's all good. I think it's hysterical sometimes, of course, but I enjoy it. It's good fun. Yeah. So,
well, before we move on from the mood and the serotonin syndrome thing, like, I don't know if you know, I sell lithium orotate, and I've played around with 40 milligrams a day personally, just as an experiment. And I'll pulse it. I'll do that once or twice a week or something. And it is interesting because if I start to feel off, I stop taking it and I go back to normal,
which
I'd imagine
a week typically.
Yep. Yeah. And what's interesting is it has you might know, a strong effect on GABA. So it's a GABA promoter. And and I think it inhibits dopamine and glutamate. So it's like an interesting modulator of those, but it has a lot of other effects too, antiviral and stuff. But I feel like it's a great adjunct. Like when I take that with methylene blue, I feel super balanced. I enjoy that feeling. So
that's a good call. I mean, I think that when you have those additional neurotransmitters around, because methylene blue works and it does increase those, and it's called a monoamine oxidase inhibitor, MAOI-A. There's an A and B, but as a result of that, it increases serotonin, norepinephrine, and dopamine. That's great. But if you're already sort of on the mildly anxious side or have a lot of stress, sometimes that can be a lot. And so I hadn't thought about lithium orotate, but I think that's a great, nice addition. What I often find can be helpful is giving people cofactors that are responsible for energy metabolism. So like your B vitamins, your minerals, that can be really helpful because you're revving up metabolism a little bit so that you're giving the support so that the system can create enough energy and have enough support while you're increasing the amount of ATP that's being produced overall. What I find if I take too much methylene blue personally is that I got to go out and do something. I can't sit in front of the computer. Like I got to go exercise. I got to go move because it's like that norepinephrine dopamine thing. But I can imagine bringing in lithium orotate would be very helpful there because it can help kind of like stabilize on the GABA side as well, which I dig. And of course, I'm a big fan of the GABAergic neurotransmitter system. And I know we've spoken about that before.
Yeah.
But honestly, like I have a number of integrative psychiatrists that are weaning their patients off of antidepressants and giving them methylene blue instead. And it's a process, right? It says you don't come off an antidepressant in a day, but you can slowly wean them off. And then methylene blue gives them that support, like that mood enhancement that they need. And that was an interesting story I just heard from a colleague. I guess they were giving methylene blue to an older patient that had like kind of like the older, maybe like 70s in that time frame. Maybe I can't remember exactly what the age was, but they had lost their spouse a couple of years before that, and after losing their spouse, they're just kind of more depressed and like kind of mopey and not moving around. And she give them to give this guy 4 milligrams of methylene blue, and he was like a different person. He refused SSRIs, he refused all the antidepressants, but he took just 4 milligrams of methylene blue, and he's like a different person. He was like up, he was moving, he was doing stuff around the house, like he was engaging and he was social. It didn't take a lot, right, to see a huge benefit. And I think that's like those kinds of stories. Initially, I was shocked by how many stories we were getting. People with better energy, with better mood, their brain fog being gone, their inflammation improving, their pains better, their infections got better quicker, like all these things. But now it's like we get so many stories almost every day about people just having amazing benefits overall. So, and the mood part, I'm not going to discount. So Paul telling me or the audience that you're only better from methylene blue because of serotonin, I disagree with that. But is there a component where the mood elevation is helpful? Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. A previous guest that I don't have on anymore, he talked about the locus ceruleus. I don't know if you've looked into that, like that part of the brainstem. In Latin, it's called the blue spot. And it actually synthesizes, you mentioned earlier, the norepinephrine, which is the same word as noradrenaline, right? Or it's a different word for noradrenaline. And I've been getting back into cold plunging, as I told you, just really 3 minutes, quick plunge, 57 degrees or 5 minutes. And that boosts that or increases that. And I've found a great synergy there. So it feels like methylene blue can fit into so many different things. I mean, obviously getting outside and getting sunlight in your eyes, right? And that effect on the mood. And it's just a synergizer with so many cold exposure, sun exposure, like different supplements.
Yeah. I mean, I think the way I usually describe methylene blue in a lot of podcasts and conversations is like, I'm saying it's a magic bullet. And that's what it was originally termed as back in the 1890s, because you could give a huge amount of methylene blue overall and you would kill bugs in the system, like malaria, but you wouldn't harm the normal cells, the normal host cells. And that was kind of the eureka that they were looking for, like the hallelujah moment, because there were no really other drugs around to do that. And so it did get that name. But what I always say and we started off the podcast with this, is like not everybody needs to take methylene blue all the time. It can be something used as needed for the various reasons why people need it, from recovery, from performance, from infection, going on an airplane and protecting you from all those fun things that happen up there. But you don't need to use it all the time. Okay, overall. But if you do have a chronic complex medical illness and you can't get out of bed, or you're so sick that nothing works on you, and this is common, you can use very small doses of methylene blue, slowly titrate those doses over time, and get people feeling better enough so that they can do other things in their life that they couldn't do before. They could get up and take a walk around the block. They can call a family member and say hello. They can start taking some supplements or change their diet or whatever it might be. So it's a good gateway drug in that way, in the sense of getting people feeling better enough that other things, or maybe it's like a cornerstone drug would be better, like a cornerstone of a building, right? It's like the foundation, where methylene blue can work in a similar way to help move and shift the system in a way that everything else gets easier for you to do. So I think that's really what it comes down to. And the other piece that always gets into the mix here is that, well, it's synthetic. I shouldn't take anything synthetic, should I, Matt?
I know that argument well. Yeah, it's funny because with B vitamins, I had and the late Dr. Cass Ingram, he was a legend, the guy that started basically the wild oregano movement, and he was speaking out with that for COVID, which I think I was using that high dose, and for short periods of time, it was great for Lyme disease. But he was, he was kind of a whole food supplement only based, and I was in that for a very short period of time, and then once I started reading studies on, non-GMO cornstarch derived ascorbic acid, it's like you can't argue with the effects that has when used properly, and coal tar derived B vitamins in the right active forms like P5P and stuff, TTFD, B1. I mean, you can't argue with the effects, and I don't care what they're derived. I mean, as long as it's not like tortured humans, or it's like petroleum, whatever, Yeah,
I mean, it's all a base product, right? And then they're taking the chemicals and they're creating something different, right?
Yep.
And so I always go through this argument with even my own patients still, when like, well, I don't want to take methylene blue because it's synthetic. And I go, okay, let's have this argument, right? Let's have a conversation. It's not an argument, right? The first thing is, everything that's natural good for you? No, right? If you go out in your backyard and forage for the wrong mushrooms, you might end up with liver failure and die. And I've seen this happen. When I was in medical school, remember, these two people had gone foraging for mushrooms. They stayed in our ICU for 2 weeks and they both just died. And so not everything that's natural is good for us, and not everything that's synthetic is bad for us. We live in a synthetic world. We don't live in nature. I don't care. I know even you tried it, Matt. It's not easy. Homesteading is not easy. And even then, there's synthetic things that you needed to try to keep you alive and maintain, right? And so it's not a matter of natural or synthetic. It's a matter of what these compounds are doing and how they're changing or shifting our physiology. And we live in a synthetic world, and methylene blue as a synthetic compound can be extremely helpful a lot of the times. Now, should we also be thinking about the natural things? Of course, our diet, our lifestyle, our relationships, our behaviors. This is all very, very important. But sometimes we're just not ready to make those moves. A lot of people are. And so how do you make those moves? Sometimes it's a matter of starting things that may be synthetic. And then, as I always say with methylene blue over time, is that if my hope is that you do not need as much methylene blue over time, and that you can use it in more of a targeted way. That's not what a supplement company would like to be saying, right? But the challenge with that is that most of us live in these worlds. We live with these lights. We live with everything around us, right? And it's not optimal, right? And so as a result, bringing in something like methylene blue can be very, very helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what came at us in 2020, I don't think anybody expected it. I didn't, and I think I went 2 years where I'm like, oh, I'm not going to get it. I'm so healthy. I'm taking the right supplements. And then just like, bam, I kept getting hit with it with the different variants or whatever.
Yeah.
And I'm like, well, obviously I need to add some more things into my toolkit because my immune system is not as robust as I thought. So it was a great test there. But yeah, I forgot about the synthetic argument. That was awesome. And one thing I wanted to get into, Scott, too, was the mitochondrial effects, which you've touched on a few times in this conversation. But I've heard, I think both of them, Saladino and Master John, made the argument that if your mitochondria are functioning properly, then
You shouldn't
methylene
take
blue. Yeah, you
Yeah.
shouldn't take it,
Because
right?
it can make it worse. Yeah, it can make your mitochondria like worse. My argument or response to that is twofold, right? The first one is we've already discussed 94% of US adults already have some element of mitochondrial dysfunction. And so that there's 6% of people that are optimized out there. Congrats to Paul and Chris, maybe for being those two people. But even those people, even those 6%, are going to have more stress on their system on a regular basis. So these are the people that don't need to take it very often, but they could take it when they're doing more performance work or going on an airplane or going to be under bad lighting at another terrible conference or something like that, right? And so why do all these conferences under bad lighting and bad food, right? That's like, it's kind of like the calling card of any conference, even health conferences these days. So that's the first element to their argument. And the second aspect of it is this. The studies that they're quoting to show that mitochondrial function goes down in normal tissue, the study that I know of at least, is that there was a study done in stroke patients or stroke animals. Okay. And what they did is that they gave a high amount of methylene blue as a rescue agent for these animals that had strokes. What they saw was that in the area of the stroke, methylene blue rescued brain tissue. So it prevented brain tissue from dying. This, we would all agree, is a good thing, right?
Yep.
What they also saw in the non-injured part of the brain was that there was some element of mitochondrial dysfunction when they gave these very high doses of methylene blue. So this is not surprising to me. They gave very high doses, around 2 milligrams per kilogram or so. And they gave it like in an IV kind of thing, right? So this is a lot of methylene blue getting to the brain very quickly. Mm-hmm. And then the other aspect of this is that these very high doses of methylene blue, not only do they help with making energy and detoxing, but they also make more hydrogen peroxide in the system, right? And so they're going to cause more stress on the system too. And so it's a risk versus benefit ratio is what I would say. But it was not a significant decline in mitochondrial function. There was some decline and it was temporary overall. And so my thought here, my sense here is that it's a risk versus benefit ratio in the sense that if you have a stroke, I'd rather save the area of the brain than worry about mild mitochondrial dysfunction someplace else for a short period of time, right? And in addition, if you have a severe acute infection, it's probably better to treat the infection faster than with a higher dose of methylene blue with the potential risk that you might get some mild mitochondrial dysfunction in a normal part of your brain. And another corollary to this is a study that they did on Alzheimer's patients. They used 3 doses of methylene blue. One dose was 8 milligrams twice a day. Another dose was 75 milligrams twice a day. And the other dose was 150 milligrams twice a day. Okay. Wow. So either 60 milligrams total a day, 150, or 300 milligrams. So 3 doses, okay? So the 60 milligrams a day was the placebo group. It was the group that they put in there so that everybody had blue urine, basically, okay? So who do you think did the best in this study?
The low dose?
Yes, low dose. Good job. I did a good leading the witness there. The low doses of methylene blue, those sham control patients did better. Why? Because my sense, those higher doses were causing too much stress on an already stressed system overall. And because if you already have Alzheimer's, you already have a brain that's under more stress in general, right? And so if you give these higher doses of methylene blue, you're forcing the system to create more hydrogen peroxide and what happens after that is the body's trying to compensate for that by making more antioxidants like glutathione to neutralize that. But if you don't have glutathione producing capacity, you're not going to be able to neutralize that huge amount of hydrogen peroxide that's coming in the system. So in essence, it is a risk versus benefit ratio if you're using very high doses of methylene blue. And that's also why I don't use high doses for long periods of time. And if I have to, then I'm also giving high dose antioxidant support. So in the end, it's a great idea. It's a great argument that you shouldn't take methylene blue from a non-clinical perspective. But from a clinical perspective, it makes a lot of sense to use short-term with support, knowing what we just described. And that, again, is clinical medicine. It's not reading a book or reading a study and you should say, you should do X, or you should do Y, because that shit doesn't work. It doesn't work with people. doesn't work.
Do you think some of the scare stuff, and I've seen this with, like, I've had some shows with, genetic optimization coaches, which kind of, gone away from, because I think you can get a little too crazy with that. But with gene mutations, I'd imagine there are some, like, I think Master John mentioned that glucose 6 phosphate dehydrogenase deficiency.
G6PD, yeah. So a couple things on that. It's a good topic. I mean, the first one, I always say with genetic screening, like doing your genome or whatever, going to your 23andMe or the equivalent of that, these tell you what may happen, but you don't know what is actually going to happen. Yep. You don't know, even if you have a SNP or a mutation or whatever, you have no idea what the expression of that SNP or mutation is just from looking at your genes. So like it's more just a maybe, or like, so some people, we always talk about MTHFR here, like your motherfucker gene, right? So everybody, I mean, it's more common than not to have a mutation in that gene, okay? So, but how much that gene is actually causing an issue or expressing itself is extremely variable overall. So let's just say that. And so whenever I'm talking to my patients or clients and they're like, well, can I get my gene screen? I'm like, you can, but it's not going to change what I'm going to do, most likely. Like if you have your ApoE allele and you have a high risk of getting Alzheimer's, it's not going to change what I do. But it may change your motivation, right? And I understand that, right? So I think there's a place for it overall. So with G6PD specifically, glucose 6 phosphate dehydrogenase, this is an enzyme that helps the stability of our red blood cells overall. So have you seen Hannibal Lecter before? Hannibal? Fava beans? Fava beans? And so if you have G6PD and you have a shit ton of fava beans, these fava beans can make your red blood cells break because you don't have this G6PD enzyme to help help protect your red blood cells, basically. And so very high doses of methylene blue in the IV have shown to potentially cause stress on red blood cells enough that if you don't have this enzyme, that you can break up your red blood cells. So G6PD deficiency is not that common, but it is possible to have it. But there's never been a study that I've seen that showed any issues with oral methylene blue. Now, if you're taking high doses of oral methylene blue over periods of time, then I would recommend getting a G6PD test for sure. Low doses, it's likely safe. We haven't seen any issues. We haven't had any reports over the last 5 years, but it is something that we get a decent amount of questions about, and it's reasonable. And if you're worried, it's a simple test. You can get at LabCorp or Quest or whatever your local lab is to get a G6PD test and see if you ever want, as I think you know this, Matt, like IV vitamin C, you need to get a G6PD test before you do that, because it can cause that oxidative load to be great, and as a result of that, you can get this lysis or breaking of red blood cells, and you don't want to do that, obviously, if you don't need to. And so, but we haven't had any reports of that. We actually, interestingly enough, as a corollary kind of to that, is that there are people that have a genetic issue with their red blood cells called thalassemias. So like there's beta and there's alpha, I think beta, and there's a couple different alpha, beta thalassemia. And this really means that you turn over red blood cells really quickly overall, and you have less capacity to carry oxygen. So not surprisingly, hyperbaric therapy can be very helpful there, but also methylene blue, because what methylene blue can do is it can work just like oxygen in your cells and help you continue to make energy for longer, even if you don't have as much oxygen around. It can act as what's called the final electron acceptor on complex 4 in the mitochondria, also called cytochrome oxidase. And so methylene blue can act just like oxygen, which is what oxygen does there. That's why we need oxygen. And so if you don't have enough oxygen around, methylene blue can actually take the place of it. And so in these thalassemias, or if you're going to altitude, or if you're going on an airplane, these are places where you're at less oxygen around. We've had fantastic reports of people climbing in the mountains or coming to visit me here in Colorado and feeling much better overall than they would typically when they have methylene blue on board. So I'm interested in the thalassemia thing because that's relatively common overall, and I have seen some benefit. But anybody that has low oxygen around or less oxygen around, so you're at altitude, you're going on an airplane, you're going to climb mountains. We have people, with blue tongues on Kilimanjaro, on Denali, not on Everest yet, but hopefully soon, and other places around the world. It's pretty cool.
That's awesome. I would say too, combine it with Shilajit, because that's been traditionally used for high altitude A&Es and stuff like that. So what's your protocol for flying? Because I'm flying down to California for my dad's birthday next month. If I recall right, it might have been you or someone else, like 16 milligrams before you board and then 16 milligrams when you land, or what's your protocol personally for flying?
So my protocol varies. I mean, it really depends on the length of time that I can be on an airplane. It's a relatively short flight that you have from where you are to California. So what I typically recommend is loading before you get on the plane, typically about 4 hours before, and then potentially another dose on the plane. Whatever dose is most optimal for you. So we have a whole protocol on the website, on Troscriptions website. If people are interested, they can check it out. Just like, just to search jet lag, and you'll see we have a whole protocol of like, because what we try to do there is try to really help with jet lag specifically, right? So the jet lag from the hypoxia, that's easy. You can just take methylene blue. But the jet lag from the time change, the circadian rhythm change, we have a very specific way that we've kind of created. Like, it's 9 a.m. at your destination, take this much methylene blue. It's 12 p.m. at your destination, take this much, that kind of thing. So, but in general, for domestic flights, what I'll typically do is I'll load between, I'm a relatively low dose kind of person, between 4 and 8 milligrams before I get on a plane, and then another 4 to 8 milligrams, 4 to 8 milligrams when I'm on the plane, as long as it's not terribly close to bedtime. And then maybe when I get there, depending on the situation overall. So, but in general, I would say for most of my patients, they're taking between 4 to 16. Actually, on a day of flying, it'll be anywhere between like 8 to 16 milligrams, maybe up to 25 or 26 milligrams of methylene blue on that day of flying overall. And then, I can add different things on depending on the situation, but a really nice supportive overall. You're at low oxygen on a plane, you're in shitty air in a plane, you're sitting next to the person that's coughing on you in the plane. What's interesting about that Chris Masterjohn article, thumbs up, is that he did start the article by bashing methylene blue. But in the middle of the article, he did accept the argument that methylene blue could help on airplanes, actually. And he talked about hypoxia. Although I disagreed with him on the point where he said that, so at sea level, we're at 21% oxygen. On an airplane, you're pressurized to about 8,000 feet above sea level. That's the equivalent of about 16% oxygen. Okay. He was arguing is that that's marginal. And I call bullshit on that, right? Like, if you've gone from 0 to 5,000, 6,000, or 8,000 feet in a single day, which I've done on a mountain, it doesn't feel good, right? And so people come to visit me in Colorado, the first couple of days, they don't feel very good, right? This is at 5,000 feet. So another great jet lag hack, by the way, live in Colorado, because you're going to be already at 5,500 feet where I live.
When we almost met, when I was living there, what was that, 2.5 years ago or 3, whatever? And Conifer, I think it was like 10 or 11. It was something crazy. I don't know how high Colorado. I felt horrible the whole time, and I should have, if I would have been taking Troscriptions, I probably would have been fine, but I felt horrible the whole time living there.
I mean, it's hard. It's hard to be at, like, what I found for most humans, most humans can do like 8,000 tops. Anything above that is just shitty. And even with, more red blood cells and everything else, but even 8,000 is high. I think that the sweet spot, if you're going to be at elevation, is probably between like 3,000 to 5,000 feet, or maybe 6,000 feet is. And they've actually done some longevity studies, or like, retrospective things. And like, there seems to be a sweet spot around there overall from a longevity perspective. Yeah. I don't know.
I think I'm about 2,600 here, roughly. Where I'm at.
Yeah. That's good. I think like a little bit of altitude's okay. But that's a good jet lag hack, actually. I found that when I moved to Colorado in 2021, my jet lag was like so much better after I started traveling. I'm like, why is this? And I realized because I'm at 5,500 feet. When I go on an airplane, I'm pressurized to 8,000, as opposed to when I lived in California and I was living at 0 feet of seawater and then going to 8,000 on an airplane. And so there's a big delta. And what's weird about it too, Matt, is that there's a huge variation in sensitivity to this. You'll have some people that don't have a lot of sensitivity to these hypoxic changes, and you'll have other people that are really sensitive to them overall. And so I fall into the latter category, I would say. And so, like, as a good example, I tried to climb Mount Whitney when I was in college, and that's about 14,000 feet, but I didn't make it to the top. I had altitude sickness. But the guys that I was with, this was in college, they smoked all the time. They were like pot smokers, cigarette smokers, didn't take care of themselves. And I realized they were protecting their lungs from altitude. So they were already mildly hypoxic all the time anyway, right? And so as a result of being mildly hypoxic all the time, they had no problem getting up. And I'm like, headaches, and I got to turn down. And
well, speaking of smoking, I wasn't expecting to talk about this in our conversation, but sometimes you trigger me because you're like, and I know you sell, you have a nicotine in your blue canatine, and you're like, but don't smoke it. And I'm like, bullshit. No, no, but I like cigars,
Yeah.
but I take days off and stuff, but I know it's carbon monoxide and there's, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, and there's problems with smoke in general, and it messes with oxygen. So I'd imagine methylene blue is it'd be good for smokers, right? If what you described earlier.
Yeah, it would definitely be good. I mean, the challenge with the smoke is, it's not just nicotine. It's got a lot of other things in there.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think like an average cigar has about 100 milligrams of nicotine on it too. It's like, it's a lot if you're,
it's a good amount. Mm-hmm.
If you're inhaling it overall. But yes, it's going to protect from the hypoxic stress from, having cigarettes or smoke that's going into your lungs. In the case of these people that I went on the mountain with when I was in college, it was protective for them so they could go to altitude because they were used to being more hypoxic more often overall.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm not a big fan of smoking anything, but each their own. What it comes down to it, Matt, though, as you know, like I don't know what they call them, like the varieties of tobacco, like we've bred in all this other crap to it over the years to make them more addictive, worse for us. So like if you were a Native American 10,000 years ago and doing hop-a or you were smoking tobacco, I'm sure it was fine, and I'm sure you can find some varieties now that are much better than others as a result of the world we live in. So that's something, that I consider too.
Yeah. I mean, I've grown it before in a pyramid, funny enough, in my RV days, and it actually was pretty good. They didn't get huge, but they're
easy to grow, right? It's pretty easy to grow.
Yeah, it was Nicotiana rustica, and it's a carnivorous plant. Bugs would stick to it, and it would literally take the nitrogen from the bugs. So I don't see a reason to necessarily spray it, because they're like, oh, they spray it heavily. I'm like, it eats bugs, so unless it's super unhealthy, you don't need to spray your tobacco.
I didn't know it ate bugs. Okay.
Yeah. It's sticky, but yeah, it's funny. We had people send in questions, and I think you answered like all of them indirectly. So maybe we could start to. Well, I guess did we cover all the arguments? Or?
I think there's one more topic that I think might be helpful, which would be to chat about nitric oxide for a minute. There's been a lot of people worried about methylene blue inhibiting nitric oxide. Nitric oxide is a compound that our body makes in various locations for different reasons. Mostly when we think of nitric oxide, most of us are thinking about our cardiovascular health. Nitric oxide is produced in our endovascular lining, our endothelium, to help with vasodilation, to dilate blood vessels overall, and help with the contractility, so to make them more elastic. The nitric oxide is also produced in our mitochondria as a signaling molecule to help with redox status and helping bring more blood to the various cells that are making more energy. So by dilating blood vessels in the surrounding area to help bring more substrate. So you need more glucose to make more energy or more ketones, depending on your situation, right? And so, but there's a different type of nitric oxide that's produced from an enzyme. So the enzyme is called nitric oxide synthase. And there's inducible nitric oxide synthase with an I, and then there's endogenous nitric oxide synthase. So what we were just discussing so far is the endogenous nitric oxide synthase enzyme produces nitric oxide in the blood vessel wall, and then in the mitochondria itself, and also in the brain and a couple other places. Okay. But the inducible nitric oxide synthase enzyme is induced to make nitric oxide when there is infection, ischemia, inflammation, and overall stress trauma. Okay. This nitric oxide is free floating. It is circulating in the system. Okay. And as a result of that, thumbs up again. And as a result of that, that nitric oxide is also causing inflammation. And it's a significant implicator. So it's very much implied in why we have significant pain initially as well, nitric oxide. Okay. So what methylene blue does is that at low doses, it inhibits this nitric oxide synthase. It's called the inducible nitric oxide synthase. So it actually decreases the amount of nitric oxide that's free floating. This free floating also causes low blood pressure, by the way, as well. At high doses of methylene blue, it is actually doing this too, but just to a more of an extent. So over 1 milligram per kilogram, especially IV, excuse me, you're going to have more of this inducible nitric oxide synthase neutralized, so you don't make this inducible nitric oxide. So this is a good thing as well. So short story there is that almost any dose of methylene blue is going to have a neutralization effect, this inducible nitric oxide. And that's the kind of nitric oxide that we don't want hanging around because it's related to inflammation. It's related to low blood pressure. It's related to pain. So this is the type of nitric oxide that we don't want floating around. Methylene blue at almost any dose is going to have an effect on this inducible nitric oxide. And this inducible nitric oxide effect is going to be more depending on the dose that you make, or the dose that you take, excuse me. Now, let's go back to the endogenous nitric oxide supply. Low doses of methylene blue, 4, 8, 16, 25 milligrams, do not have a detrimental effect on the production of endogenous nitric oxide supply at all. And they've done studies looking at this, okay? And then what it does do at these low doses, which is very interesting, is it revs up energy production, as we've talked about, right? Of making energy, making ATP. So when that happens, more nitric oxide is actually released from the mitochondria to signal the blood vessels in that area to dilate, so you get more glucose, more ketones to the area to help you make more energy. So instead of decreasing nitric oxide in the endogenous location, it's actually probably increasing, okay? Okay, so but higher doses of methylene blue, over about 1 milligram per kilogram, for sure, definitely in the IV, are also going to affect endogenous nitric oxide supply. So high doses of methylene will affect inducible nitric oxide and endogenous nitric oxide. So you will have, as a result of that, you'll have vasoconstriction. So your blood vessels will constrict down, and you will have an effect on how much nitric oxide is being produced endogenously. Okay. But these low doses of methylene blue, 4, 8, 12, 16, will not have a detrimental effect on endogenous supply. And they might have a positive effect by increasing the amount of nitric oxide produced as a result of the energy that you're making. So what is the brass tacks here after all? Keep your dose of methylene blue low as much as you absolutely can. If you're going to be on a high dose of methylene blue for a long period of time, take nitric oxide boosters with it. And even with some of my patients that are on low doses over time, I will give them some nitric oxide boosters too. But if you're going to be on a higher dose, like over 1 milligram per kilogram, but over about 30 or 40 milligrams a day, then I typically recommend taking nitric oxide just in case at the same time. But low doses, 4, 8, 16, you don't have to worry about it. It's not having a detrimental effect on that endogenous supply, only that inducible supply, which is what we don't want anyway.
I haven't heard, is that another argument that people are making? Because I haven't heard this relationship. Okay.
Yeah, it's one I get a lot. Yeah, because people worry about oxide and my blood vascular health and like my muscles and my heart and my mitochondria. And it's reasonable because nobody realizes, or very few people realize, there's a difference out there. There's a difference between inducible nitric oxide synthase that makes nitric oxide that's free floating versus the endogenous, which is in your vascular wall and in your mitochondria and your brain, a couple other places. And so low doses of methylene blue have no detrimental effect on that endogenous supply, but they do work on the inducible supply. And so that's why they could be great for people with hypotension, low blood pressure, and inflammation and stress. And I've seen this, on countless occasions where you give these low doses and all of a sudden people feel so much better. Their pain gets better. Their inflammation gets better. Their overall blood pressure gets better too at these low doses because you neutralize that circulating nitric oxide.
And there's a connection too with I know, because I've looked into EMFs pretty extensively, like superoxide and then the formation of peroxynitrite, which that's that bad inducible nitric oxide, right? That's a part of that.
So EMFs are very well known to hypothetically, and depending on what you believe, to increase that inducible nitric oxide as well. So any stress can do it. Physical stress, emotional stress, infection, trauma, they're all going to cause nitric oxide release into the vascular system, be circulating. So what happens with the technical part to get into the weeds is that what methylene blue prevents is from that nitric oxide synthase enzyme, it prevents it converting arginine to nitric oxide. And so it prevents the step there. And that's what methylene blue can do. And so that's why it can be very powerful. And so if you're around a lot of EMFs and you are sensitive to them, if you are taking methylene blue, it can be very, very helpful overall too.
Cool. And when you use you said nitric oxide boosters, you might be familiar. I think he's in the biohacking space. The lozenges, the NO1 or something. I tried those. I didn't feel anything. I did their schedule of one every 12 hours. I didn't notice anything.
Usually if you don't notice anything, you don't need them kind of thing. Yeah. Typically, if you do notice it, it's something that you do need to be taking overall. So there's a couple different companies. N101's definitely one. I know the founder, his name is escaping me right now. I can see his face.
Brian or something.
Yeah, Brian.
Nathan.
Yeah, and then,
Brian.
And then there's other companies that make it too. There's a company called Calroy that I use a decent amount. They have some oral supplements that
I've tried that one. Yep.
Yeah. And again, you shouldn't definitely feel a huge amount, right? I mean, it's not something like if you're feeling it, it could mean you actually have taken too much overall, because if you take too much nitric oxide, what's going to happen? I just told you, your blood pressure is going to drop, right? And so this is why using methylene blue for people with positional hypotension, tachycardia, like POTS kinds of things, I've actually seen some really great overall benefits in those patients, because their blood vessels, they constrict up a little bit. And, because of that binding of inducible nitric oxide, and they feel much better, shockingly,
Well, that's awesome. Yeah, that's a whole area that I'll have to look into more, but I think you broke it down pretty well. So right on. Yeah, this was fun. And I'm sure it seems like you're doing a round of shows to kind of debunk this stuff, right? And it sounds like it's fun for you.
Yeah, no, I enjoy it because it's fun to be able to come from a place of, do you really know what you're talking about? Right? Because I'm doing this much longer than you, and I'm seeing patients for a living. What do you do? And so I think that there's a lot of great information from people that do not see patients, but as you and I both know, like, you don't want to take somebody's personal stack. I don't really care who they are, because it's not your stack, right? And so when you hear people like Huberman and others, there's a lot of these people out there, but Huberman's probably the biggest culprit, is like, yeah, these are my protocols. Like, use my protocols. I'm like, dude, they're your protocols. They're not other people's protocols. Or like Brian Johnson, this is my protocol. Take 165 supplements per day and stay vegan. Like, no, not going to work for you. I promise. Right? Like, you're not going to do well. And this is the world we live in. And it's okay. But I enjoy the opportunity to have a little bit of fun with it and set the record straight as best I can.
Yeah. Well, awesome. Well, I think we're at the tail end, so we don't have time to go through the Troscriptions products, but people could check them out. We've actually, had shows where we go into TroCalm, we went to TroMune on previous shows, and
you've been really, I've been really grateful for the opportunity to hang out with you and talk about the products, Matt. So yeah, anybody that's interested in those, they can check out one of the other 17 episodes that Matt and I have recorded, and they're also interested. You can go over to Troscriptions.com or at Troscriptions on Instagram. And that's the company that we're talking about here that makes methylene blue products. We have our Just Blue at 16 milligrams, blue canatine, which is methylene blue with nicotine, caffeine, and CBD. That's always a favorite. And then we have a higher strength methylene blue for practitioners called Tro Plus Blue. Just watch what you're getting out there, everybody. Like, be careful with the quality of the stuff that you're getting. If you're not getting our stuff, I can't vouch for it. People always ask me, like, how many drops should I take? I'm like, I have no effing clue, how many drops you should take, because all the liquid that we tested, the potency didn't meet label claims. And so it's all less potent than what we make, because we make what we say we make, right? And so just be aware what you're getting out there. Make sure it's coming with a certificate of analysis. Check out, heavy metal content. We always are able to, we publish all that stuff, and you can always ask us if you're interested. And we have a lot of blogs on methylene blue, a lot of blogs on everything that we do at Troscriptions. And so check it out. And, I appreciate, being here with you, Matt. And you have a code as well, too. I don't remember the code right now. But
Blackburn. Yeah. And you guys are on my website, matt-blackburn.com. And yeah, my two favorite products by far, the ones I use 99% of the time, Just Blue and TroMune. And I don't get over caffeinated too often now that I have like a low stress environment and not a stressful relationship and all that stuff. But if I ever do overdo the caffeine or just feel more stressed, I don't know if it's a genetic, but it astonishes me how grounded I feel when I take TroMune. It's like clockwork every time. So I always have it with me in my backpack, and I'll just take a whole square at a time and I'll just swallow.
I love it. Yeah, I mean, it can really just ground you. I love that. It's from a mushroom, I guess, too, which is it's been
awesome.
Cool. I really appreciate the time, and it's good to see you again.
Thank you, Scott. It's always so fun. Stick around as we close it out. Thanks so much. I learned a lot from that show. I hope you did as well. Every time I talk to Dr. Scott, it's amazing how deep they're going into the methylene blue research. The material about nitric oxide I found very fascinating, how it at low doses inhibits inos, which is the inducible type that he said is linked with inflammation and ischemia and infections and stress and trauma. And it's really the endogenous or the enos that we want. And it doesn't affect that, at least at the low dosages. And I think it's really easy to think about it in terms of milligrams per kilogram. I remember when I read the book by Mark Sloan on methylene blue, he had a great chart in there on the dosing. And I think that's where a lot of people get confused. And there's so many dropper products out there, which if they're tested, great. They're tested to be clean. That's awesome. But what I appreciate about Troscriptions and what the people over there are doing, they're lab tested to be super pure. And the troche form, these little solid squares that you take, it's really easy to dose. That's why I like pills more than powder, because it's precision dosing. You don't have to sit there and measure. You just know exactly how much you're taking. And like I told Scott, I generally take a whole square at once. That's just what makes me feel the best. So I'll take 16 milligrams, which is one whole square of the Troscriptions whenever I dose it. And I feel amazing taking it. And I can take days off and I'm fine. But the days that I'm feeling, as I told him, a scratchy throat, I'm coming down with something, or just a lot of stress or travel, I definitely feel stronger when methylene blue is in my system. So if you'd like to check it out, it's troscriptions.com and my discount code is Blackburn. Like I said there at the end, the Just Blue product and the Tromune are my favorite, but all their products are awesome. The Trozy is a super innovative sleep formula with that agarin compound in there. The Trocalm's awesome. That one just kind of is a little spicy to me, so I don't take that very often. And if I do, I just swallow the whole square instead of holding it between my tongue and cheek. But the Tromune, that cordycepin, that's probably my favorite product from them. I was really not expecting to feel that really grounded effect from it, like taking away all the caffeine jitters if I ever get those almost immediately. And I just feel my nervous system just chill out every time I take that Tromune product. And this is after taking 3 grams of cordyceps extract, often in my coffee for years. And that just goes to show that extracts are often superior to the whole food substance, because it takes a lot of cordyceps to make that cordycepin extract that's found in the Tromune product. So highly recommend you try just all their products, see which ones you like, and stick with them. Obviously, the Just Blue, I have that in my backpack every time I fly down to Southern California for birthdays with my family. Makes a huge difference. I used to feel like I was getting hit with stuff. I'm pretty sensitive to feel if my immune system is taking a hit. But every time I dose the Just Blue product, it feels like a shield is up and it's impenetrable. And I just feel like there's no way that I could get sick, especially combining it with all of the Mitolife products. So if you want to save on their products, the discount code is Blackburn. And you'll see that product and many more on my website. It's matt-blackburn.com. We call it Matt's Market. So they're all categorized. You can click on dental care or bedding or light therapy or sleep or supplements and see all the things that I've found over the years, most of which have discount codes associated with them. And I am working on getting the CLF protocol back up there. I get asked often about that. So stay tuned for that. That is still in the works. I didn't forget about that protocol. My supplement brand is Mitolife. You can find that at mitolife.co. And a lot of the products appear to be missing, but on a desktop, it's kind of easier to navigate click the shop tab, go down to surplus, and a lot of our products are pretty much at cost. So you can save a whole lot of money. You can experiment with megadosing. And the reason why they're on surplus is the best buy date is approaching, which to me is a really loose recommendation from my research on that whole subject. Antioxidant substances, even L-carnosine, certain amino acids are in that. Certain amino acids in jellyfish jolt for sure, because that contains all of the amino acids, but definitely vitamin C, vitamin E, even vitamin K2, any compound with an antioxidant quality to it will last so much longer than the recommended 2 years that is kind of the industry standard or whatever. I posted a study a few times on the potency of vitamin C. This was in tablet form, so I think less protected than powder inside a capsule. And it retained 95% of its potency after like 6 to 8 years. It was a significantly long time, and I'll definitely be stockpiling antioxidants when I move into the bunker because they last forever. It's a really good idea to stock up on antioxidants. Just screw the expiration date. Don't even worry about it. They will last a very long time because expiration is oxidation, and antioxidants donate electrons. They protect against oxidation. A lot of omega-3 products like the algae oils, they're going to add in different extracts to it to preserve it. Oftentimes there's a little bit of vitamin E, or with cod liver oil, like the Rosita, they add a little bit of rosemary to it. And if it's stored properly out of direct sunlight, in a relatively cool room, a lot of these products last a very long time. So just something to think about. Our coffee's back in stock. That's the Columbia roast. We do small batch coffee at MitoLife. I have friends in the industry. So it's just a little fun side project. That is under the living tab. You also see the grounding sheets and the shampoo and conditioner, which are really innovative. The wellness tab, you'll see the supplements, and then the water tab, you'll see the under-counter 7-stage filter, which was custom built with my friends after a lot of blood, sweat, and tears and money. Really proud of that product. And the KDF shower solution, which I believe is the best shower filter on the market. So check out all that stuff. My intention is to help people, make it affordable. I see a lot of these boutique brands really overpriced, just garbage, liposomal products, just marking it up a ton. So I try to have sales as much as I can and just try to make this really accessible to as many people as I possibly can, because the world needs to be healthier for the brain to function better. More functioning brains means a better world for everybody. Make critical thinking great again. Follow me on social media. It's Matt Blackburn on Instagram. I'm also on Facebook, although I don't post there very often. I am thinking of potentially doing less frequent shows because honestly, I've been having trouble finding good guests that are providing a lot of value that aren't well known, which is a hard combination to find. And I always love talking to Scott. He provides so many solutions, the way that he describes things, perfect, getting into the biochemistry. I love all of that, but it's hard to do that every week. So I'm trying to do more solo shows, but long story short, stay tuned to my social media because I might be going to less frequent shows here on the podcast, just because I want to keep the quality high and continually share really innovative and detailed information, not just about mental, emotional health, spiritual health. There's a lot of shows on that, but really focusing in on the physical as much as I can, because I really believe that that is lacking, especially with all the noise out there, anti-supplement, anti-synthetic supplements. I really like to be a force to resist that and share counter information to that backed up with legitimate research. So I will maybe see you guys next Friday. If not, then I'll see you the following Friday. In any case, I'll see you soon. Thanks for listening. If you enjoy, share with your family and friends. Stay supercharged and stay rogue.